Welcome back. Last time we started looking at the ways Jesus would teach and preach, and we highlighted the Sermon on the Mount, right? This is a perfectly structured teaching, but Jesus used other methods of teaching as well, right? For example, he liked to teach by parables. What's a parable, right? That word parable is a compound Greek word, right? Para meaning alongside of, right? Like a paralegal, and that verb bol meaning to throw, right? A parable is something you throw alongside a common ordinary truth that would be heard hundreds of times. And so many times, right, we would hear it so many times that we wouldn't even hear it anymore, right? And so you would throw a parable in to drive in the point, right? A parable is thrown alongside to illuminate that teaching in a striking and memorable way, right? Much like the introduction to the Sermon on the Mount. And so Jesus would say things like, well, you know what? I'd like to tell you a story. Right? And understand this, that Jesus was a great storyteller, right? And his stories are memorable, right? We still read them and we still remember them 2,000 years later, right? And we are still influenced by them 2,000 years later. And we are still delighted by them 2,000 years later, right? He was teaching, for example, right, on the hill just west of Capernaum, right? It was about a 10-minute walk. And it was a hillside shaped like a natural amphitheater, right, with perfect acoustics. And he told the parable of the sower who was sowing seeds, right? And I don't think Jesus just made up a parable, right? I think he was looking around and he was looking at the people and wondering what they were thinking about that day and seeing what they were thinking about. And that was the news of the day, the gospel of the day, and he would use that stuff to tell stories, to illustrate stories that would, or tell stories that would illustrate old truths. And as he was teaching on that hillside, he would be towards the bottom of the hill, and the people would be sitting up on the hill as he was speaking, right, a natural amphitheater. And as he would speak on the hill, he would be speaking there, and it's an agricultural area. And so as he's speaking, he notices the farmers. They're on the hillside and they're over there and they're planting their seeds. And so he would say to the crowd, a farmer was sowing his seeds, and then he would point over towards the crowds. He said, look over the crowds. And sure enough, there were farmers over there throwing seeds down on the ground. Right? It's something that they had seen every year their entire lives. So Jesus would say, a farmer went out to sow some seed, and some of that seed, man, it fell on rocky ground. Right? In that area, when you clear an area for planting, there's all these rocks. It's so rocky that you pick up all the rocks. There's so many rocks that you build rock fences around your land. He says some of that seed fell on rocky ground, and the heat came up and it scorched the seed, and they died and they bared no fruit. Other seeds, it fell among thorns. Well, in the springtime on that hillside, it's covered by mustard plants. And those mustard plants are big bushes with bright yellow flowers in the spring. And the whole hillside is in bloom with this bright yellow mustard seed plants. And then amidst the mustard seed plants are thistles that sprout up during the springtime. And those thistles are about the size of a tennis ball. And they have this bright purple color, right? It makes for an absolutely gorgeous hillside. But Jesus will say, some of that seed, it fell among the thorns, and it fell among the thistles of the mustard seeds, and they were choked off. Right? It took root, but there was no room for it to grow, and so it would wither and die. But other seed fell along good soil, and it took root. Well, it is illustrated right there in front of Jesus with the farmers on the hillside, with the farmers sowing the seed. And so Jesus used that story and then tells them what it means. Right? It is a living illustration that is relatable in that moment. And that's how a parable works. All right, think about this. Jesus told other parables as well. Right? He told a parable of a poor woman who didn't have much money at all, and she had been saving it up, but then she lost a coin that made up a big portion of her savings, and she lost it. Right? It's like having money in your pocket, right? You have 5 $1 bills and a $10 bill, and then 2 $100 bills wrapped around in them. Those $100 bills, they fall out of your pocket and you lose them. Well, what do? You look everywhere for them, and that's what this woman did. Right? She looked everywhere for that coin. And when she found it, right, she was so happy. She was so delightfully happy. Right? And she told all of her friends because that she had found the coin. Why? Because they had been helping her look for it. And they were all so happy for her. And they went out and they had a little party together because of it. And then Jesus, after that, Jesus told another story. A story about a lost sheep. The shepherd took his sheep out and he went out with 100 sheep. And when he came back that night, he was counting them. Okay, 95, 96, 97, 98, 99. Where's George at? Did George wander off again? And so he put the sheep away and he goes out that night to find that lost sheep. And when he does find that lost sheep, he picks him up and he throws him over his shoulders and he carries that sheep home. Well, think about this. A sheep is a whole lot more valuable than a coin. And a good shepherd, right? You might think, well, hey, he has 100 of them. Well, and they're all the same, so he could probably afford to lose one. But no, he's a good shepherd. And he goes out after that lost sheep and he carries him home on his shoulders, carries him back home that way. And then Jesus tells another story about a lost son, right? We call him the prodigal son. And this son had a wonderful father, a father that loved him and did everything for him, right? And it was a beautiful home, and this kid had a bright future, and yet this boy hated it, right? He hated his father. He hated everything that his father stood for. He hated his home, and he hated his brother. He hated the servants. He hated all that. And so one day he got so mad and mad at his father. He said, you know what? I'm sick of this, right? Dad, I don't even like you anymore. I don't even like this place. No, I want my inheritance now, and I want to get out of here. So what did his father do? Father grabbed his checkbook and he wrote a check for half the value of his entire estate. And he gave it to his son. And his son turned his back on his father and he walked away. And of course, his son, right, we know the story. He went to the big city. He squandered all of his money and he ended up in the pig pen. Right? He ended up taking care of pigs. Right? He ended up in the poorhouse. Right? He probably ended up being a drunk. He probably ended up being on drugs. At some point, he had sunk so low. They said, you know, man, what am I doing here? Right? I got to go back to my father and I'll apologize and if I can just have a little bit, I'll tell him that I was wrong. He goes back to his father, just expecting just a little bit. If I can just have a place to stay. His father had every right. Right? After the way he had treated him, after the way he treated his family, after the way he had disgraced him, right? His son had disgraced him. He had every right under Mosaic law to take that boy to the town gates and accuse him and have him stoned to death. But he didn't do that. No, said he ran out to meet his son and he embraced his son with a big hug and he threw a huge party in his honor. Right? The lost coin, the lost sheep, and the lost son. Right? Each one with increasing value. All three illustrating what? Right? It's not a story about a coin, a sheep, and a son. No, it's a story about us. That we get lost all the time and God comes looking for us and he carries us back home on his shoulders. And he will never say, you have disgraced me, now get out. No. Right? These are three parables that illustrate a truth in such a striking and memorable way. So at one point, Jesus' disciples, they ask him, right, Jesus, why do you choose parables? Right, why do you teach in parables? Right, why that particular method, Jesus? Remember what Jesus' answer was? He said, you know what, you're my inner circle, right? You get to travel with me, and you get to stay with me, and you're on the road with me, and you get to hear these teachings over and over again. Right, we sit around the campfire at night, and you ask these questions, and we have these late night discussions about all these things. Then Jesus says, you know, these mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, right, they've been revealed to you, right? You have had the opportunity to probe them and to gain deeper insight and deeper understanding. But these crowds, they don't, right? These crowds, right, they might get to hear me only one time, right? 204 towns and villages, right? There's a lot of traveling. It's a very big job, right? How many times in Galilee would a person have a chance to hear Jesus? Right? Most people just one time. Now, some might travel to the next place and hear him again, but for the most part, you get one shot at preaching to a crowd. So you have to make it striking. You have to make it memorable if you're going to make an impact. And so Jesus chose parables as a method for doing that. Right? Jesus didn't invent parables. Right? Many of the rabbis taught in parables. Or in fact, if you read the Talmud, many of the great rabbis, they taught in parables. Right? Parables were their method of teaching also. But what Jesus did, right? Jesus, man, he was really good at it. And he chose that method because it was striking, because it was memorable, right? And if you only have one shot, right? If you only have one shot to reach an audience, this is the way that you do it. So Jesus, right? He was a master teacher. And people would ask questions and Jesus would be right there with a story to illustrate the answer. So is it any wonder then, right, going back over to Luke chapter 4 and verse 16, is it ever wonder then that Jesus, remember he went to Nazareth, right? But he went to his hometown and he taught there. But the people were asking, man, where in the world did he learn all this? Right? Because he grew up here in our little town and right, he learned at the feet of our rabbi who's probably not the best, right? He's just in this small town. But our little rabbi, he taught him to read and write. At 12 years old, though, right? Remember, he was bar mitzvahed in Jerusalem, and he came back, and he was done with his learning. He went to work with his father as a carpenter, right? He didn't have some elite education, right? Where did he get all this from, right? He didn't go down to Jerusalem to study with the great rabbis. No, isn't this Joseph's son? Right? That's what they said, right? And they were all dumbfounded. Others were as well. Nobody had heard of Jesus in Jerusalem, but he has a huge following in Galilee. Jesus, he was a brilliant teacher. Well, the turning point in our story comes when Jesus takes his disciples to Capernaum and the region around the Sea of Galilee, right? 63 miles north to Caesarea Philippi. And think about this, only one thing happens there. Right, think about this. 98% of Jesus' ministry takes place in an area no bigger than a small city. Right, from about 9 o'clock on the Sea of Galilee, right, if you view the Sea of Galilee as a clock, from 9 o'clock to about 1 o'clock, right, that arc there, and that northwestern portion of the Sea of Galilee is really no bigger than a small city. Right, and Jesus only left that area a couple times. He left there once to go to Tyre and Sidon, right, and he did one thing there and then he came back. And then again, he went up north to Caesarea Philippi. He did one thing there, and then he came back. And then 3 times a year, he would go to Jerusalem, which is about 100 miles south. He went there for the Pilgrims festivals, right? He went there for Passover. He went there for Pentecost, and he went there for the Feast of Tabernacles. But really, that was it, right? And think about this. He didn't have a radio ministry. He didn't have a television ministry, right? He wasn't posting his videos up on YouTube, right? He had this small city. That's all it was. But what an amazing thing he did in that small area. But towards the end of those 3 years, what did Jesus do? Jesus took his disciples up to Caesarea Philippi. And in Caesarea Philippi, understand what Caesarea Philippi was. This was the center for the worship of the pagan god Pan. Right? Picture the pagan god Pan in your mind. The bottom half is that of a goat, the top half of a man. Right, with a narrow, pointy face, with a pointy goatee. Oftentimes, he's depicted with goat ears and horns. In most presentations of Pan, he has enormous phallus sticking out. Right, he is the god of the good time. He is the god of the orgy. He is the god of the drunken revelry. And that's where Jesus takes his disciples. He takes his disciples up to Caesarea Philippi, where the temple of Pan is located. And Jesus says to his disciples there, who do people say that I am? Right? In contrast to this God that is emblematic of the Roman Empire, right? This God Pan. Who do people say that I am? And the answer is, well, some say that you're a prophet. Others say you're John the Baptist, come back from the dead. But then Jesus said, who do you think I am? And I love this, that Peter answers for the entire group. He says, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus says, you know what? You are absolutely right. And then Jesus takes them north to the top of Mount Hermon. Now, Mount Hermon is not a summit. Mount Hermon is a 50-mile long mountain range that is snow-covered most of the year. But Jesus takes them to Mount Hermon where he is transfigured before their very eyes. That Greek word for transfigured is metamorphosized, right? It's where we get metamorphosis, right? Like a caterpillar becoming a butterfly, right? Jesus was not simply getting bright, but fundamentally and profoundly changing. And witnessing this changing is Moses and Elijah, right? And in the presence of those two witnesses, God the Father, right? And a voice from heaven validates Peter's confession of faith by saying, "This is my beloved son. You better listen to him now." And God the Father validates Peter's confession of faith before two credible witnesses, Moses and Elijah. It doesn't get any better than that. But from that point, Jesus heads back, right? Jesus and the disciples, they head back from to Capernaum, and they head all the way down to Jerusalem to enter Jerusalem on what we call now Palm Sunday, right? It is a profound moment in our story, right? The first half of the Gospels, right? Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Synoptic Gospels, right? The big question is this, is who is this man who can say and do such things? Right, and the disciples are asking that question continuously, right? Who is it who can say and do such things? But after Peter's confession of faith, that is no longer the question, right? After Peter's confession of faith, we know who Jesus is, right? The disciples know who Jesus is. And so now the question is, what does it mean? Right? What are the implications? What are the implications for him? What are the implications for his disciples? And what are the implications for you and me? In the second half of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the question is, what does it all mean? And Jesus gets to Jerusalem on what we call Palm Sunday, and he enters Jerusalem as a king. Right? He enters Jerusalem on the exact day that Daniel chapter 9 said that the Messiah would arrive, Passover AD 32. And he enters Jerusalem on a donkey, imitating in every detail the way Solomon entered Jerusalem when David elevated him to the throne. And this is not lost at all on the crowds. Right? Thousands of people are on the Mount of Olives waiting. And as Jesus rides down the Mount of Olives towards the temple platform, all the people are shaking palm leaves and proclaiming him Messiah. Right? Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the Son of David. Blessed is the new King. Right? And they're waving palm leaves, these palm blades. And what are they? They are symbolic swords. Right? They are symbolic of swords. Right? Imagine 10,000 people on this hillside shaking symbolic swords, proclaiming the coming of the Messiah, proclaiming the coming of the King who will throw off the shackles of the Roman Empire and usher in the kingdom of God. With all of that taking place within eyesight of the temple area, right? And the Antonia Fortress on the northwest corner where Pilate and the 10th Roman Legion are stationed. Right? And they can see this happening, right? Not more than 400 yards away, right? I think there's going to be big trouble happening, right? And the religious leaders, right? In their administrative offices, they can hear the shouting. They can hear the cheering and all the proclamation. They see the waving of these symbolic swords. And the religious leaders are thinking, man, we have a civil emergency on our hands. Right? The Romans, they are going to see this and they will come down on us like the wrath of God. And it will be all over for us. And Caiaphas, remember Caiaphas, the high priest, he said in an executive session of Sanhedrin, he said, it doesn't matter if he's the Messiah or not. If he continues to do this, there will be blood. And we will lose whatever religious freedom we have. And we will lose our nation. Remember what he said, it is better for one man to die than the entire nation to perish. Right? That is the issue at stake. Right? Civil unrest, a riot, and the end of Israel as we know it. And that is what is at stake for the religious leaders and the Romans. As Jesus rides in, right, and provokes the crowd, exactly that. Right? He provokes exactly that. Right? And that is where we're going to pick up next time. Right? Jesus on the week of Passover leading to the cross. God bless. We'll see you next week.